All right, then let's get the recording started. And let's go through some of the stuff we want to do today. So I wanted to go over two things. First, I figured we'd go over the group activity you all did last class. I also wanted to go over the quiz for the appeals to authority. There's some things that didn't go as well as I was hoping for in that quiz, so I figured we'd go over it just to refresh and make sure that everyone's on the same page. So let's just start by going over last class's group activity. For the most part, it looked like people were doing pretty reasonably well on this, but let's just go through it and make sure everyone sort of got the idea pretty soundly. So we have, first case, you have 501 people in a jail of 1,000 people are guilty of a crime. So this is the world's worst jail, right? Slightly better than 50% success rate. Nevertheless, it is slightly better than 50%, so it is somewhat likely. You can think about this. It's a bad jail, certainly, but if you had to guess, if you were forced to make a guess as to whether or not Joe committed the crime or not, based on the evidence available to you, the rational thing to believe would be that Joe indeed committed the crime, right? Not by a lot, by the slimmest of all margins, but nevertheless, by that slimmest of all margins, you'd be more rational than not to assume that Joe is indeed guilty. All right. Now, in this case, on the other hand, it's 975 out of 1,000, right? It's very likely, right? It's not by the slimmest of margins. If you had to guess, again, the overwhelmingly rational thing to guess would be that Joe is the person who's guilty, right? So this is hopefully a better jail. So the overwhelming majority of people present in this courtroom today are not guilty of murdering the victim. Therefore, the defendant in this case is not guilty of murdering the victim. He is here, isn't it? This is an example. You might have heard this term before. What's called sophistry, right? Bad legal arguments that are intended to mislead or to corrupt the jury. This argument commits the fallacy of incomplete evidence. The relevant statistic, right, or the relevant percentage, what would matter is what percent of defendants in a trial are guilty. The fact that you are not a defendant, the fact that you are a defendant means that you're already different than just the average person in the courtroom, right? Because who else is in a courtroom? You've got the jury in a courtroom. You've got the prosecutors in the courtroom, the judge. Witnesses of various sort might be present. Maybe his members are present in the audience. But none of those people were thought suspicious enough that they were arrested and then indicted. So someone who has been both arrested and indicted and it's gone to trial, that makes you far more likely of being guilty than just being the random average person in the street. So let's just pause for a second. Any questions on any of those first three? All right, and let's keep going through them. Same thing is going on number 4. So most people from the People's Republic of China do not speak English. Therefore, the newly imported ambassador doesn't speak English. Again, this is the fallacy of incomplete evidence. The relevant statistic is what percent of ambassadors in China don't speak English. And indeed, maybe even that's not specific enough. Ambassadors to English-speaking countries, maybe. Because again, you expect an ambassador of a country to be far more likely to actually speak the language than the average person on the street. All right. Here, these next 3, the sort of a trick to see that what matters is the overall likelihood of the conclusion, not just the sort of numerically how high the percentage is. So in this case, since only 10% of qualified applicants are admitted to Harvard Law School, you should probably plan on getting in. This person's pretty obviously making a mistake, right? It is unlikely to be true, right? They're just assuming that there'll be an exception to a rule that otherwise sort of holds 90% of the time, right? If you sort of not 10% of the time you won't get in, that means 10% of the time you will get in, rather, that means 90% of the time you won't get in. Similarly here, even though the percentage is only 10%, right? 10% of the time you will get in, 90% you won't get in. So there's actually an overwhelmingly good chance that you will not get in, right? Even though the percentage is low, they're still very likely to not actually be able to get in. Lastly, this one commits the fallacy. The national debate champion is probably far more likely to get in than the average qualified applicant. Is that, again, that's the statistic that would actually be relevant. That's the percentage that would actually matter. What percentage of national debate champions don't get in? Then lastly, almost all people, this one is just to show that sometimes you can do this without actual percentages. Almost all people are taller than 26 inches. Gareth is a person, therefore Gareth is taller than 26 inches. This is very likely, right? Almost all, we don't know exactly what percentage it is, but that seems to be quite high. Definitely more than 75%. So this would be very likely. And then again, the last one commits the fallacy. Newborn infants are likely to be smaller than the average person. Right, so what we actually would have needed is what percentage of newborn infants are taller than 26 inches, not just the people. All right, so like I said, from what I could see, mostly it looked like people were doing pretty well with these. I still have 2 more to grade, so I'll send those back to everyone during my office hours if they're not too busy, or by the end of the day at the very latest. Anyone have any questions from that group activity? Anything, any of those problems people would like to discuss in any more detail? All right, then let's also now turn to that quiz on the appeals to authority. So people didn't do as well on this quiz as I was hoping. There's some very common sort of details that a lot of people missed. So let's just go through this just to make sure everyone's on the same page. And again, we can sort of stop and ask some questions and go over anything people sort of overlooked. So your task in the first question was to explain the mistake that's being made in the appeal to authority. So you're told, in this case, something's gone wrong here. What is it? What's gone wrong? So what's wrong with your car? Well, it's pretty technical, and I can't really explain the specifics to a layperson, but suffice to say it's busted pretty bad. I will need to do extensive and expensive work on the car. Right. So there are actually 2 problems here. Most people correctly identified the first problem, right? The first criteria that is violated, the expert can't give a sort of non-technical explanation. So that's the 7th criteria. And indeed, this is indeed a problem, right? I mean, you should expect someone who really knows what's wrong with a car to be able to explain it, right? Even if it still goes over my head almost, right? Just the unwillingness to offer any sort of explanation, that's indeed suspicious. Now, if you stopped here, and a lot of people did, a lot of people only pointed out this one problem with the argument. Then in terms of the second question, where you're supposed to say how serious is the mistake, I probably would agree with you if you only picked out the first. This is probably grounds for more suspicion. As many people said, maybe this guy is just a little bit socially awkward, or maybe just isn't really a confident speaker or something, and that doesn't necessarily invalidate his expertise if otherwise, right, he's a qualified mechanic or something like that. But the problem in this case is there's another mistake here. And very few people brought this point out, but it's actually really important to analyzing this problem. There's a massive conflict of interest here. the mechanic has a direct financial incentive to overcharge you for repairs. Or to do unnecessary repairs. Right. Now, again, and this was the fifth criteria. Right? And so just by itself, again, this might not necessarily be that big of a deal, right? Because, I mean, yeah, again, in a capitalist society, everyone's going to have, you know, financial incentives to do inappropriate things or do illegitimate things, right? So, of course, every mechanic has some measure of conflict of interest, right? Because it always will be in any mechanic's best interest to overcharge you, just like the same thing is true of doctors and other kinds of scenarios we've been looking at too, right? So, again, in and of itself, and in the abstract, in a vacuum, this conflict of interest, maybe it's, again, not that big of a deal. It's present, it's worth being aware of, right? But in the abstract, maybe not a huge deal. Together, though, I think these two are a huge deal when they're actually combined. I mean, actually, imagine like someone just, literally think of this like you're in a mechanic's office, right? And the mechanic is just like, no, I'm not going to tell you what's wrong with your car. Give me lots of money. You wouldn't accept that. That's just not acceptable. Both of them together means that the argument commits the fallacy. Right? Because, and a lot of people even like mention this, but didn't derive the right from it. Like this, together, both of these factors make it seem like this person is literally just trying to rip you off. And so therefore, you should not go with what they say. I mean, at minimum, get a second opinion. If not, just find a better mechanic. Find a mechanic who actually will try to explain to you what they're going to do with the money you give them. So that was the really big thing I noticed. We'll talk about the other question too, because there's a few little issues with that. But the big thing I noticed was with this first question, not noticing that second sort of problem, or the second violated criteria, I think led people to sort of give what was otherwise a plausible enough answer for how problematic that the error was. But together, if you had noticed the both of them together, I think the error becomes pretty overwhelming in this case. Does anyone have any questions? Anything anyone wants to go over on that particular problem? All right. One last little thing on the quiz. For the next question, what really has mattered here is that you need to actually be specific, right? So I didn't just want to see a generic answer here, right? But I wanted to see really specific things you would need to know, and you needed to explain the relative importance, right? How much the things you identify individually matter. And in this case, we've got someone who approaches you claiming that they've discovered evidence of alien life on Mars as a result of data sent back by the Mars rover probe. In this case, right, the overwhelmingly most important criteria is have other experts evaluated the same claims and reached the same conclusion as this person. So some combination of the peer review and the sort of second criteria, where sort of was far and away the most important sort of factors in this particular case. So I needed to see some discussion of both of those things. Any questions on any of this just sort of review stuff that we've been doing? Just wanted to make sure, particularly with the appeals to authority, I wanted to make sure there can be more than one violation, and the way that the violations interact with each other can frequently really alter how you sort of evaluate the appeal. So any other questions or any other comments on anything? All right, then let us turn to the inductive generalizations. Let's just review where we were last time. All right, so last time we just introduced the rough form of these sort of the inductive or statistical generalizations. These are arguments where you sort of look at some small sample group and then infer on the basis of that sample group what's true of the overall population. So the key factor then, the only thing we're really going to be worried about, since we're not going to be doing math here, right? The only thing we're really going to be worried about is is the sample group actually representative of the overall population? And if you've got a representative sample group, you're good to go, right? Otherwise, we just have to do a lot of math to sort of answer any more questions. So this is going to be the question we do to sort of be math-free, but still at least starting to think about how to make sense of arguments of this form. And then we went over the first criteria. There's going to be two criteria that go into making a sample group representative. This first one, the sample group must be sufficiently large enough. This is one we're not going to worry about mostly. Mostly, this isn't going to be sort of our concern. You really need to do a fair amount of math to calculate exactly how large the sample group actually needs to be. And indeed, you can calculate this rather precisely, right? And if you were a statistics class, we would indeed calculate rather precisely just how large it needs to be. But we're just not gonna be concerned with that. So unless it's sort of egregious, unless it's like I talked to 3 people and that's supposed to represent the entire nation or something like that, don't really worry much about this first criteria. An argument that does violate the first criteria, so let's go back to some of the fallacies we talked about earlier in the semester, the hasty generalization fallacy and the anecdotal evidence fallacy. These fallacies, both now we can sort of characterize them again, or characterize them a little bit better. They're cases where the sample group are not sufficiently large. And so the hasty generalization fallacy is where you look at just too few cases of something and then infer what's true also. My friend had one Dell computer and it broke, so all Dell computers must be terrible. And too small of a sample group. Depending, you could also be the anecdotal evidence fallacy too, right? Depending on whether or not it's your own experience that you're giving too much weight to, or just the sample group is too small in general. That's pretty much what we went over last class. We introduced this second criteria, but we didn't really go into it in much detail. So the second criteria, and this is what we're going to talk about mostly today, the sort of relevant diversity that's present within the sample group must reflect the relevant diversity of the overall population. Think of this in terms of demographics. What's going on here? Right. If we're doing, say, an opinion poll, if that's what the sort of relevant, if that's the sort of what we're doing with our sample groups, right? So I'm polling people. I need to poll people who, in fact, represent the overall population. So, okay, let's say it's a political question, doing political polling. Okay, what kind of things are relevant in political polling, right? Well, we know that young people are more likely to vote in certain directions than older people. We know that rich people are more likely to vote in certain directions than poorer people. We know that people with college degrees are likely to vote in different directions than people without college degrees, right? And all of so on, right? We all know the things, right? Gender distinctions, racial distinctions, yada, 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 right? So we know all of these things matter, right? That these different kinds of groups, these sort of demographic groups, they all tend to vote in slightly different directions. So if our sample is to really reflect the overall population, our sample will need to contain basically the same demographics as the overall population does. Right? There should be about as many rich people in my sample group as there are in the total population. There should be just about as many men in my sample group, percentage-wise, as there are men in the total population. And again, sort of so on and on. I think this idea, I think is somewhat intuitively obvious, right? The sample just needs to be a good reflection, right, of the overall population. What we're going to talk about the rest of today is some strategies that can be employed to make sure your sample group is indeed representative. But before we do that, again, that was all just what we talked about last time, so just that was all review. Any questions and anything from the review? All right. Then let us start talking about random sampling and sampling methods. The main tool that people who are actually doing these kinds of generalizations employ to ensure representativeness is randomness. So this is sort of the best starting strategy, right? And the principle here is that if you randomly select a large enough group, just as a result of statistical randomness, you should end up with roughly the same right proportions of everything. And so let's think about it like here. Let's use a really simple example. Let's say I've never seen a coin. I don't know. So I mean, you know, like a quarter or something. I've never seen a coin. So I don't know how many faces coins have, and I don't know how likely it is that a coin will land on any one particular face. All right. Well, if I flip a coin, let's say 3 times or 4 times. Let's say I flip a coin 4 times. Is it that unlikely that I'll get 4 heads? Not especially. I mean, it's not likely, but it's certainly possible that I could get 4 heads. I could get 4 tails. I could get a 50-50 split, which is actually the right answer. Or I could get, you know, maybe 3 heads, 1 tail, or 3 tails, 1 heads. Right? And all of that's pretty likely. It's only four trials, right? So getting 4 straight heads isn't that impossible. I mean, it's rare, but it's not. I can get unlikely, and it can happen. If I flip a coin 10 times, though, I'm way more likely to get something close to 50-50. And if I flip the coin 100 times, or 1,000 times, or 1,000,000 times, right? At that point, we should expect me to basically be at 50-50. Right? You get it large enough, and just through randomness, you'll ensure that your sort of demographics match up correctly. The disadvantage of just using straight randomness is that you potentially need a lot of people, right? So if I poll, there's 300 million Americans. So if I poll 100 of them at random, it's quite likely that I'll just get unlikely. I mean, I could call, you know, 7 people from Wyoming, but there's not that many people in Wyoming. I just got lucky with that, and therefore it's not going to be a representative sample. If I could poll enough people, if I had enough money and I had enough time and enough resources and get good enough response rate, that maybe I could poll 1,000,000 people. That's still, you know, 0.3% of the total population. But if I could still poll 1,000,000 people, we'd have good reason to suspect that just as a result of statistical randomness, I've probably gotten a pretty representative sample with my million people. That's not super likely, though. Right? I mean, that would be incredibly expensive. It would be incredibly difficult to actually poll 1,000,000 people. Again, people are really bad at, I mean, you all probably know this just with yourself. It's really annoying to fill out these questionnaires. They take a long time. There's a very low response rate. It's very unlikely that I'd have either the resources or the capacity to get 1,000,000 samples. So what gets used instead is something called stratified randomness. Stratified randomness is basically supposed to make it so that you can get away with a smaller sampling. And this practice of stratified randomness, this is sort of the gold star. This is the best practice, right? If you could, this is what you should always do. Now we'll talk about, it's not always possible, but if you could, this is always what to do. The idea of stratified randomness is that you have to already, in a sense, know the demographic information of your population. So let's use as an example here a political case. Let's say I know that, I'm going to make these numbers up, but let's say 25% of my population is over 50, over 60, 50% is between 25 and 60, and 25% is under 25. If I know this already, what I can do is I can randomly select people in these proportions. So I can go out of my way and find 25% of the people that I've randomly surveyed, make sure that 25% of those people are over 60. Or if I polled more than that, let's say my random sampling accidentally got me, 35% people over 60, I'm only going to weigh all of that 25%. And ideally, I do this with all the demographics. So if I know all of my demographics, if I know that, 75% of my population makes less than $100,000 a year, then again, weigh that, right? Like that, however many people responded, I give that are in that demographic, I give that demographic 75% weight. If you use this sort of stratified randomness, if you sort of randomly select within known demographics, you can have a far smaller sample size than you otherwise would need to get a representative sample. And so all those national opinion polls you see, right, about like, so who's going to win the election or whatever, almost all of those polls are carried out with like 2,000 people, 2,000 respondents. But indeed, they are representative because what the pollsters do, at least if they're good pollsters anyway, they're using stratified randomness. They're taking advantage of the fact that we have reasonably good knowledge about how different demographics tend to vote. And so we know what demographic information is relevant, and also taking advantage of the fact that because of things like national censuses, we have a reasonably good percentage of, a good understanding of what percentage of the general population fits into each demographic group. And so as a result, you can get away with 2,000 people to represent 300 million and do a reasonably good job. Not perfect. Again, these are inductive arguments, right? And it would be better if we could poll 4,000 people. Or what would be best of all, if we could poll 100% of the population, then indeed we would know what was true of the whole population, right? But we don't have the time, the money, the resources to actually do all of that. So we can get pretty reliable results we can be reasonably confident in on the basis of much smaller samples. And again, these are inductive, so that's good enough, right? It's a reliable result if we can use this sort of stratified randomness technique as sort of a best practice. So how are we doing so far? Is this idea of stratified randomness that I'm not sure if I explained that as clearly as I would have liked. Are people clear about what I mean by that, or would more examples possibly help? How are people feeling about this idea of stratified randomness? All right, I will interpret silence as things are going okay, but that's always dangerous. So if things are not going okay, please don't hesitate, send me a chat notice or something. All right. Even stratified randomness is frequently really difficult to do, though. It takes money, time, resources, and knowledge. If you don't have a great deal of knowledge about your population, it's just not even possible to use stratified randomness. And moreover, it just takes money and time, right? Setting up polls, incentivizing people to actually fill out the poll. It takes time, it takes money, it takes resources. right? And it won't always work out. I mean, and so as a result of this, frequently people have to use sort of like techniques that they know are going to be flawed in certain respects, but it's the best that they can do. For example, if I was just to randomly mail out an opinion poll to a bunch of people, just not very many people are going to return it to me. So I'm going to have to, that maybe is the best I can do. It would be better if I could pay people to take my survey, right? But I probably can't afford to do that. People frequently have to make do with sort of second best techniques. Things that sort of fall short of best practices. And mostly that's what you're sort of going to be in a position to evaluate. We're going to add another fallacy, the fallacy of biased statistics. And this fallacy occurs. Oh, hold on, we got a chat question. Let me see what we got here. Yeah, someone was suggesting that even if I did actually offer to pay people for the poll, even that has its risks, and you're quite right to even to point this out. Even if I offered to pay people to take my polls, that has risks too. I'm way more likely to get people who are poorer to take my polling, right? Because people who are poorer are indeed far more likely to need the money than, you know, Bill Gates. Bill Gates is probably not going to, I'm not going to be able to offer Bill Gates enough money for him to take my opinion poll. It still might be better than not, because probably there's a higher percentage of poorer people than richer people. But you're quite right to point out that, yeah, I mean, even using that sampling method, actually, that would be an example of potentially the fallacy of biased statistics, right? Particularly depending on specific issues with the demographics in particular. So let's define this fallacy of biased statistics a little bit more precisely. Fallacy of biased statistics is when your sampling methods used in the statistical generalization egregiously misrepresent the overall population. I.e., where there's some sort of egregious problem such that the sample does not represent the population. So this isn't just where, yeah, there are some problems with it, but this is where the problems with it are sort of systemic and large, right? So this is where sort of something's gone very obviously wrong. And so a lot of the examples I gave you last class were actually indeed examples of the fallacy of biased statistics. If I try to figure out how dangerous car crashes are by interviewing some selection of people who've been in car crashes, my strategy is disastrously bad because indeed I can't interview the people who die. I'm only going to get the survivors of car crashes using this sort of method. And since that's pretty egregiously bad, this would be an example of an argument that commits the fallacy. Another example, right? This is a more subtle one, but let's hope we can sort of figure it out. So let's say I'm trying to figure out how people feel about Social Security. And to do this, I randomly call on landlines a bunch of people. What is the problem with randomly calling 3,000 landlines? Let me ask you a question. Do any of you, and I actually like genuinely want to know, do any of you actually have a landline? Is there a single person here? Okay, so what? Obviously, I've got like, so we got like about, according to the chat, 4 of you have landlines. I've seen 4 people, a few thumbs up. That's right. Oh, and one of the people, it's because they moved back in with their parents. That's perfect. That's actually a perfect response. I don't have a landline, and besides my mom, I don't know anyone who does have a landline. And indeed, I think this is sort of showing the danger, right? Who owns landlines? Predominantly older people. Right? So if I employ this methodology, then I'm necessarily going to get a dramatically older populace. And again, it'll do it fairly dramatically in this case. So yeah, I mean, now the same thing would be true though if I change this from landlines to cell phones. The same thing is going to be true because again, this is going to get me a far higher percentage of younger people, right? My grandparent, I mean, at least the one who's still alive anyway, my one grandparent who's still alive, she does not have a cell phone. And many of her friends do not have cell phones either. Again, this will also skew my statistics. Now they'll be skewed in favor of the old, or in favor of the young. And again, there's various sorts of mistakes of this sort. Like these are things where we mean where you're sort of, because of the sampling method that you're improving or you're utilizing, you're sort of systematically excluding certain demographic groups. That's what we sort of mean, or another way of sort of characterizing this. And whenever this occurs, we've got the fallacy. As people want me to go back up to the previous notes, hopefully I can do that. This is about as far up as I can go, at least. So I hope this is good enough. If there's something that that you think you missed, that something specific you think you missed, let me know, and I can just type it back up again. But it looks like once I actually raise the board up, it actually erases everything. So let me know if there's anything else that you need. All right. So how's this idea? How are we doing this idea of this fallacy of bias statistics? Does everyone seem to have a reasonable handle, at least in some examples of it? This is going to be the main thing you're looking for in most of the kind of problems you're going to get in a quiz or an exam. You're sort of going to be trying to evaluate, is based on the sampling method that's being used, are there any sort of systematically excluded demographic groups? Or sort of systematically misrepresented. And the sense of bias statistic here, it's not even that the pollsters themselves have a bias or that they're deliberately trying to get incorrect data in some sense. The bias statistics of it is just that because of the sampling method, there's going to be something wrong in the statistics themselves. So you can think about it, hasty generalization is too small of a sample group. Fallacy of bias statistics is not representative enough of a sample group. Those are sort of how those two fallacies relate to one another. People feeling okay here? All right, then let's do one last thing. We probably won't even be worth going into the groups today, which is fine. We'll just start with group stuff on Wednesday directly. So one last thing to talk about. Let's talk about margin of errors. So even the best made best designed, all the gold standard, best practices sample groups, there's still a chance of these arguments going wrong. These are inductive arguments. Sampling error. Let's think about this in terms of the example I was giving with flipping the coin again, right? Like, so let's say I flip a coin 100 times. Is it possible that I could get 75 heads and 25 tails? Yeah, it's possible. Is it really unlikely? Yes, we could indeed, if we were doing math, we could actually say exactly how unlikely it is. But the chance isn't zero. There's a chance that even though that's a pretty good technique, if I flip a coin 100 times, I'm probably going to get a reasonable sense about how likely you are to get heads or tails. Even still, there's a chance I could just get unlikely and get a really unrepresentative result. And again, the more people you have, the lower the chance of a sampling error becomes, but it will never become zero. It will always remain possible to some extent that you'll get a 0%. Nick, were you asking, did you have a question? Okay. So as a result of this is what we mean by sampling error. Sampling error is never going to go away. There's always a chance you could just get unlucky. And get a non-representative result. No matter how precise you are, how careful you are, unless you poll 100% of the population, there's always a chance of sampling error. And indeed, you can actually calculate just how likely the sampling error is. It's actually quite possible to do so. And again, you'd have to do math to do it, so we're not going to worry about this. As a result of this fact of sampling error, most good polls utilize what gets called a margin of error in their reporting of the results. So, for example, I'm going to use a example from the last election because I think this example is super interesting. This is from the 2016 presidential election. Most of the polling had it such that there's something like a 53%. This is what the polling suggested. This is what was found, and so you average together all the sampling groups, something like a 53% of the population will vote for Hillary Clinton in the election, which would have been But again, good pollsters recognize there is a chance of sampling error. And indeed, you now know there indeed was some systematic sampling error. Nick, you need to stop unmuting yourself because you're just making a lot of static. So I'm going to have to kick you out if you don't stop muting yourself or stop unmuting yourself. So the solution to this, and a lot of the polls that I saw, the way they actually reported the result, their actual conclusion was there is a 51 to 55% of the population will vote for Hillary Clinton. This was the prediction of most pollsters. At least, particularly, there was some particularly good ones that were reporting this. So what does this actually mean? What is the margin of error in this case? We have 53% plus or minus 2%. Right. Add or subtract 2% to it, right? That's this 51 to 50%. You have a range of it, right? And so on the one hand, it would have been even more overwhelming election if it had been off 2% more in one direction. But if it had been off 2% in the other direction, would have been only 51%. And indeed, it was possible she might not have lost if it was, she might not have won if it was 51%. Based on how the Electoral College works. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. She won basically 51% of the popular vote, and that 51% was sort of distributed in grouping of states, such that indeed she ended up losing the election. So it's a sort of weird result, right? Like, the pollsters seemingly got it wrong. They said the most likely outcome is that Hillary Clinton's going to win the election, and that's precisely not what happened, right? And yet, stated with this margin of error, the actual result that did occur fit within the expected margin of error. It's sort of a really weird result, right? They got it wrong. There was indeed a sampling error, but with their margin of error, they actually correctly predicted what that sampling error would look like, how that sampling error would actually sort of be taken into account. It's actually really weird, right? If I say, and this is what most people were saying, that they thought Donald Trump only had a somewhere between like a 40% chance to a 10% chance of winning the election in 2016 based on the polling. But things that only have a 30% chance of happening happen all the time, right? I mean, there's a 30% chance or something like a 30% chance that I'll flip a coin that's 3 straight times and get heads all 3 times. That's not impossible. That happens all the time, right? It's unlikely, but unlikely things can indeed happen. And so what people are trying to do with this idea of margin of error is to sort of encapsulate or include in the chance of things going wrong. Someone's asking about how this relates to fallacy of bias statistics, sort of polling stuff. And it's a good question. So for fallacy of bias statistics, it doesn't have to be intentionally or unintentionally skewed. It just has to be skewed as a result of the sampling methods that are employed. So you have to have used something less than the best sampling methods that have some sort of systemic error to it. Sometimes people know about these systemic errors and are doing them intentionally. Other times people are unintentionally just didn't realize the mistake that they were making. Either case is committing the fallacy of bias statistics. That's actually not what's going on here, though. What's going on here, even if you're using the best design samples possible, you still have this slight chance of sampling error. Okay, looks like we're actually out of class time. Unfortunately, I have like 5 more minutes worth of stuff to say. If people need to go, feel free to go. Just catch the last 5 minutes on the YouTube channel. Just because I just want to finish this one last little real quick thought about margin of error. So here's what's cool and interesting and weird about margin of error. Right? You can set your margin of error to whatever you'd like to set it to. You sort of have the ability to set your margin of error whatever you want it to be, in a sense, right? So they could have said 51 to 55% of the population will vote for Hillary Clinton. They could have identified that as the sampling error, right? Or the chance of the sampling error, so plus or minus 2%. But they also could have easily gone 43 to 63%. That'd be plus or minus 10%. Right. Pause for a moment and reflect. Which of these is more likely to be true? If these are conclusions, if you think of these as conclusions, which of these conclusions is more likely to be true? Weirdly, it's the second one. The second one is way more likely to be true. Because the pollsters have given themselves an enormous amount of wiggle room. They've given themselves, 20% basically, 20% wiggle room. Conversely, if it has to be exactly within the 51 to 55%, this is less likely to be true. And again, if they had actually just said exactly 53%, that's even less likely to be true. So margin of error actually has a weird relationship to the strength of the argument. The larger the margin of error, the stronger the argument becomes, the conclusion becomes more likely to be true. But the larger the margin of error becomes, the less useful the argument is in the first place. This, 43 to 63% of the population will vote for Hillary Clinton. That is indeed almost overwhelmingly likely to be true, and gives me almost no useful information about who is likely to win the election. Right? Because this could go from overwhelmingly crushed to overwhelmingly winning with everything in between included. That gives me no information, no useful information, even though it's very likely to be true. So polls need to sort of try to balance out. You want a large enough margin to be useful, but not too large of one that it becomes useless. Find that middle ground, and indeed, again, this is a place where you can just do math to sort of, again, another thing you can calculate is how large should your margin of error be. All right, sorry that we ran over a little bit. So that we'll end it here for the day. We'll start up on Wednesdays straight away, and you pretty much go directly into the group work. Thank you all very much. I'll unmute people if anyone wants to chat for a little bit. Otherwise, I will talk to you all later. Have a good one.